Thank you very much. It was always a pleasure. And last time I was here, I have great fond memories of it. It was about 3-4 years ago, and I talked about Turgot. And it's a little different now. I was unabashed, and I am an unabashed admirer of Turgot, and I agree with virtually everything he said. This case is a little different. It's not that I agree with everything James Mill said. I probably disagree with most of it. But I find him a fascinating character and desperately needs reevaluation. So I think I would, if I had to turn the title of the talk of the paper over again, I'd say James Mill Reconsidered. And there was a fascinating aspect of Mill. First place, his reputation until very recently was that of a third-rate popularizer in philosophy of Bentham and in economics of Ricardo, sort of a fugleman and hornblower for these two great men. And the interesting, and this I think is totally incorrect. And interestingly, he himself is partially responsible for this image. He cultivated this image. It's very unusual. I'll get back to that later because it's very rare in the history of any thought, economic or anything else, where somebody systematically downplays his own contribution. Usually the other way around. So that's an interesting historical puzzle. Why did he do that? One thing about Mill, before I start with Mill, there's two types of, going on a limb here, but I think there are two types of thinkers in the history of economics or any kind of thought. Given their equivalent brilliance and originality and multifaceted nature, Mill was very prolific. He wrote on every subject under the sun, virtually. I'll get back to that later too. But within that framework of great thinkers, there seem to be two types. One type is clear, lucid, hard-nosed, systematic, and you know exactly where he stands. You know whether you agree with him or don't agree with him. It's easy to find out. And consistent. In other words, constant, a fixed and constant star, more or less having the same views from early adulthood until the end of his life. That's one type. The other type qualifies everything he says, agrees with almost everybody. In other words, capacity for almost any kind of thought or agreement, changes his position every 3 or 6 months, so it's very difficult to figure out what he said, what did he say at another time, or this time, etc., etc. And the two paradigmatic people, interestingly enough, for these both types. Type A is James Mill, and Type B is his very screwed up son, John Stuart. And the interesting thing is the reception accorded to James and John Stuart. James considered being superficial, popularized, and John Stuart considered extremely great. And one of the interesting things about John Stuart is an interesting article by the Marquis, for the success of John Stuart Mill's principles. And I don't want to get into John Stuart here because he's not the topic. But the point is that the interesting question here, historical question, is to what extent was John Stuart Mill confused, and to what extent was he deliberately being deceptive? And it's pretty clear from the Marquis article he's deliberately being deceptive. The strategy, in addition, I think, to being confused. But anyway, deceptive in this sense that he wanted this book to be the great book, okay, accepted as the definitive work, Principles of Political Economy. And what he did was to curry favor with all groups. So if you look at his, if you look at that book and his other writings, you take all of his writings together, it also provides tremendous fodder for journal articles and PhD theses on infinitum. Was Mill a classical liberal? Was he a socialist? Was he a communist? Was he a rationalist? Was he a romantic? The answer is all of them, or none, or whatever. Who knows? And so it provides, you can have endless debates about what the true meaning of Mill was, what did Mill think before Harriet Taylor, after Harriet Taylor, and so on, it goes on forever. There are no people writing about what the James Mill really means. Everybody knows what he meant. It's very clear. So anyway, I to expose my biases here before I get into the substance of this thing. I admire the first type A. To paraphrase a friend of mine, my enthusiasm for Type B is under strict control. Anyway, the basic thesis here is that James Mill was a creative, remarkably creative thinker, and a fascinating personality in economics and other areas, political theory, political activism, and organization. And in order, I think, to understand in order to understand, well, first of all, I want to say that this revisionist there has been a revisionist movement about Mill and economics, particularly in the last 10 years or so, which I'm building on. Terence Hutchinson, a book on revolutions and philosophy, I think the title was. Revisionist and upgrading of Mill, substantial upgrading. William Sweat, is that how you pronounce it? Because I'm assuming it's Sweat. Huh? Sweet. It is Sweet? Okay. That's the thing with English names, and who knows? It could be two. Like that. William Sweet. The two of them have some very interesting upgrading of Mill. And when you take that and combine that with other stuff in political theory, Joseph Hamburger's two fascinating books written in the 60s, James Mill and the Art of Revolution, and the Intellectuals in Politics, which is ostensibly about John Stuart Mill, was really mostly about James Mill, and also include the work on the Scottish Enlightenment that's been done recently by Richard Scher, and much neglected work called Church and University and Scottish Enlightenment, and William Thomas's book on philosophic radicals. You put all that stuff together, you get a very different picture. You get to find out that the upgrading done by Sweet and Hutchinson really only scratching the surface of what Mill's do. Okay, I think to understand Mill's first place, we have to go back to the Scottish Enlightenment in which he was born. He comes in at the tail end of the Scottish Enlightenment, one of the last of the Scottish Enlightenment people. And the thing about the Scottish Enlightenment is that as Scher points out, what you've got is a titanic struggle. The Scottish Enlightenment itself is a product of so-called moderates within the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, and flourished from about 1750 to about 1800, 1810, something like that. And what you have in this period, all the great names we're familiar with, Scottish Enlightenment, and Reid and so forth, and economics and sociology, Smith and Ferguson and Hume and Robertson and a whole bunch of others. These people were essentially, with the exception of Hume, of course, these people were the power elite of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. The Church of Scotland, when Scotland and England unite, first in the late 17th century, finally early 18th, the English decided in a typical irrational but crafty way, or I would say illogical but crafty manner, instead of establishing the Anglican Church in Scotland, as they were doing in Ireland, they established the Presbyterian Church. Because they established the Anglican Church, there were very few Anglicans in Scotland. They would have had a revolution on their hands. So therefore, they established the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, the Church of Scotland, with, of course, run by the English crown and the satraps in Scotland, duke and whatever, various dukes and earls, so to speak, and the ministers being appointed by the crown. So what we have, in other words, of course, the universities in Edinburgh and Glasgow and the other universities were all church and state run. In other words, they were run by the British government and the Presbyterian Church, the established church. So that means we have a small group of very bright people, headed by Principal Robertson. William Robertson was a historian and the moderator of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, the head of it, and the president or chancellor, what they call it, of the University of Edinburgh. With royal appointment, with the royal patronage, running the Church of Scotland, to the great dismay and horror of the mass of the Presbyterian masses, who were very much opposed to this. What we have is basically, see if I can work this. In Nevada, we're still stuck with the old blackboard chalk concept. The moderates versus the been called various things. Evangelical is probably the best word for it. The evangelicals were hardcore Calvinists, and they were the official Orthodox hardcore Calvinists, and they were the ministers in the outback and the boonies. Of course, most of Scotland was boonies. Even now, it's most of Scotland boonies. Imagine how it was in the 1750s. So, the evangelicals were, I'd say, hardcore. They were against an established church, especially established by Britain and running people, and moving over them, appointing ministers that they considered heretics. The moderates had the power, they had the prestigious appointment, they had the control of Edinburgh and Glasgow, the major intellectual and financial centers, and the rest of the fundamentalists would be anachronistic to call them that. The evangelicals ran the rest of the church, bubbling out from below in revolutionary spirit. Now the differences on religion were pretty strong. Namely, and this has been played up a lot. Namely, the moderates were indeed moderates. In other words, they were Calvinists, but they were in favor of religious freedom. They were in favor of talking to atheists, for example. David Hume, the atheist and deist, whichever you want to call it. They were friendly to Hume, and another thing they did, by the way, which the evangelicals were not in favor of religious freedom. They were fairly free market oriented in economics, such as it was, but they were, when it came to religion, they were very hard nosed. I guess we can call them now social conservative, but very kindly. And but the moderates were not deists or atheists like David Hume. On the contrary, they were also hardcore Calvinists. They were in favor of one, toleration, and two, much more culturally attuned. For example, to give you an idea, one of the moderate leadership, again, who it was, put on a play. He was a playwright, put on a play. It was a very moral play. It wasn't like now. Okay, it was a very moral play for teaching a Christian lesson and all that. But the fundamental of the evangelicals said all plays by definition are evil. They passions rule instead of reason, etc., etc., and therefore they should all be outlawed. That's the kind of thing that's going on. But it's a mistake to think that Adam Smith and the other people were not really religious. They were hardcore Calvinists. They were more moderate on religious freedom questions, things like the drama and literature. And so what we have is for example, just an instance of this. When Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations, he sends a copy to Reverend Hugh Blair, who was a moderate minister, a moderate party, an old friend of his, and Blair writes back and he says, "Thank you very much, but I agree with great stuff, but one thing I disagree with, you're much too friendly to Presbytery. In other words, you're too kind to the Presbyterian Church, because Smith says in The Wealth of Nations somewhere that something like the finest people in Europe are ministers of the Presbyterian Church." Blair, having been a minister of the Presbyterian Church, disagreed, of course. His assessment. So that's the sort of thing. In other words, what we have to realize here, the point here is that these people, even though religiously tolerant, were one in favor of the state-established church, such as Smith, and two, Calvinists. Okay, so this is, I think, the point I'm trying to make here. That most of the moderates came from socially fairly wealthy families. Smith came from a family of high customs officials. This is a great point made by Gary Anderson and Collison in an article. I came from a whole family of high, sort of equivalent heads of the IRS. Okay. And which then was a more honorable position than it is now. in social status. And most of these guys were sons of professors and things like that. James Mill, however, was born, coming in late in the picture, I think 1773, was born to a poor shoemaker. And he is not wealthy at all. He's a shoemaker. A patron discovered him and paid for his education at the University of Edinburgh. And he comes in and studies under Dugald Stewart, who was a real smithy. In other words, Smith himself didn't have very many disciples. He wasn't teaching that long after he was a big shot. Dugald Stewart, who succeeded Ferguson as professor of moral philosophy at the University of Edinburgh, was apparently an excellent teacher and charismatic leader and so forth, and very erudite. And from about he was, I guess, the professor from about 1785, I think, till 1810. And at one point, in 1790, he was also, Stuart was also a fan of Turgot, a fan of Condorcet, and the classical liberals and libertarian types in France. All these guys, by the way, read French. I think important point to note. Familiar with French literature. Scotland in this period was the home of it so happened Oxford and Cambridge had gone into intellectual decline, and so Scott came with the moderates who were brilliant. You know, I might not agree with them particularly, but they were brilliant, and the Edinburgh and Glasgow attracted all the best students from England, even from the continent of Europe. So there was an intellectual flowering of the Scottish university system compared to anything then, before, probably since. So Stuart attracts, anyway, I should say Stuart in 1793, when the anti-French terror descends upon England, as England goes into war with, Britain goes into war with France, and all libertarian types or laissez-faire types were considered pro-French, were under either arrested or repressed. Ferguson recants that he always hated Turgot, he was an evil Frenchman, and stopped talking about economics for several years. By 1797 or 1798 or something, he starts the first flush of repression is over. He feels safe enough to go back to teaching political economy. And by the way, his life of Adam Smith is the first biographer of Smith, written during the Repression period, carefully avoids any mention of laissez-faire, anything like free trade, or any such subversive doctrines. At any rate, so by late 1790s, early 1800s, Stuart attracts a whole bunch of extremely bright students and disciples who become the Smithian movement in Britain. James Mill was one of them, McCulloch, another one, Henry Broome, Viscount Palmerston, Francis Horner, and a whole bunch of them. And then a couple of years later, I think in 1802, these students of Stuart found the Edinburgh Review, which very quickly becomes the lead big journal for economics in Britain. Another thing is that another influence on James Mill, early intellectual life, was Thomas Brown, who succeeded Ferguson as the professor of moral philosophy in Edinburgh, who himself was influenced by De Tracy, who was a French laissez-faire leader of the so-called ideologues, and friend of J.B. Say. And so you see right away that James Mill, growing up, was influenced with Reed Say, was influenced by Say, and also admirer of Condillac, and Cabanas, and Helvetius, and all the other French laissez-faire liberal types. Okay, well, Mill graduates, and the other guys graduate, and they find out by this time, okay, by early 1800s, whatever the period, a crackdown begins. First place, the intellectual leaders began to die out, the moderate leaders began to die out. Stuart was virtually the last one left, and the evangelicals began to take over. So by 1810, the evangelicals took back or whatever the Church of Scotland, and from then on, and then kicked out all people may consider heretics, including all the people I'm talking about, our subject here. So James Mill had graduated as an ordained Presbyterian minister, couldn't find a parish, obviously, because he was a moderate. Anybody had anything to do with Smith and people like that was obviously doomed to hell. So all these guys left very quickly. In other words, they had to leave Scotland and went to London. And the Edinburgh Review, after the first year or so, was published in London from then on, even though the name was Edinburgh Review. So we find Mill then cast loose in London, trying to make a living as a freelance writer, which now, as you all know, is very difficult and precarious. It certainly was in that period. Living by his wits, so to speak. And he starts. He's very interested in economics. I think he'd already been influenced by Turgot and De Tracy and others who have written on economics and political science and all the rest of it. And writes the 1804 writes his first economic essay, an essay on impolicy of bounty and exploitation of corn, and then Commerce Defended in 1808, plus a lot of book reviews and stuff in between. I want to pause to say about Mill in general, James Mill from then on. He wrote an enormous amount of stuff over his lifetime, books on economics, history, psychology, logic, methodology, whatever. Also journal articles on all these topics, also newspaper articles on all these topics, many of which he ghost wrote. Also, he organized everybody. He organized himself, of course. He organized his wife. He organized his friends. He was the leader of a group of 10 to 20 members of Parliament, the philosophic radicals of Parliament. And he organized his kid, John Stuart. So, and I call him the cadre type. It's sort of, he would have been known in the old days of the communist movement as a good Bolshevik. In other words, somebody humorless, energetic, doctrinaire, organizing everybody, pushing the cause all the time, at all places. And what happens in the course of all this, becomes an atheist. But the interesting thing about Mill is, and this the same thing happened, by the way, with my one of my cherished group of people, the progressive economists and social scientists of the late 19th century in America. And these people, they all started post-millennial pietists, fervent bringers of the kingdom of God on earth by government means. They're farm boys in Vermont or whatever, upstate New York. They come to college and become atheists. They find out that religion is really scientific. But they keep the entire spirit, the formative spirit, the crusading spirit of stamping out sin, of shaping everybody up through government. It's the whole mentality of you have to be working all the time and don't give in to, don't go to plays and all that sort of stuff. It all fits. And the same sort of stuff fit with Mill. The great quote of William Thomas has a marvelous book called The Philosophic Radicals, and he says that he talks about how Mill retained, even though he became an atheist, he retained the grim puritanical and crusading habit of mind of a prototypical Calvinist firebrand. And this is now a quote from Thomas. This is why Mill, a skeptic in later life, an atheist in later life, always got on well with Protestant dissenters in the Anglican Church. He may have come to reject belief in God, but some form of evangelical zeal remained essential to him. Skepticism, in the sense of non-commitment, indecision between one belief and another, horrified him. Perhaps this accounts for his long-standing dislike of Hume. Before he lost his faith, his Calvinist faith, he condemned Hume for his infidelity. But even when he had come to share that infidelity, he continued to undervalue him. A placid skepticism which seemed to uphold the status quo was not an attitude of mind that Mill understood. I think he probably understood it all too well. He didn't like it. So, crusading zeal for his beliefs, organizing everything for the movement, and Mill, by the way, after he became an atheist, puritanically disliked and distrusted drama or art. Plays, art, paintings, these are all evil. The actor he charged was a slave of the most irregular appetites and passions of the species. And Mill was hardly one to delight in sensuous beauty for its own sake. Painting and sculpture, Mill scorned as the lowest of the arts, only there to gratify a frivolous love of ostentation. And of course, he latches on to Bentham. You know what I mean? Bentham talking about rational calculator and all that sort of stuff. He loved that. And he believed that human action, like Bentham believed, is only, quote, rational, unquote, if performed in a prudent, calculating, cost-benefit analysis manner. And interesting, when he writes the history, he works for 15 years while he's still a freelance writer doing other stuff. He works on the history of British India, massive work, which so impressed the East India Company, immediately made him a high official. And finally gets a job for the first time in his life. He was 40 or something like that. And, I mean, real job of income. And he rises to become a top official in the East India Company. His kid, John Stuart, succeeds him after John dies. So, and the thing is that it's interesting the way he, in the history of British India, he writes this whole history of British India without once thinking he even has to, even considering the idea of learning any Indian language, reading anything about Indian institutions, about mysticism. He couldn't understand any idea of mysticism or asceticism or anything. His wife and military glory. None of this stuff could even last because it doesn't fit with rational Benthamite cost-benefit analysis. So, and the thing about thing about Mill is that he said he's just a humble. He wasn't very humble in general. He said he was just a simple popularizer of Bentham. Bentham was his great god in philosophy. See what happened with Bentham. He meets both Bentham and Ricardo in 1808, a fateful year for him, after he published Summers Defended, and he moves in with Bentham as his private secretary. Bentham was a very wealthy individual, was inherited wealth, sat around writing all the time, right? And he scribbled, yeah? And he writes millions of words of Bentham are still not published. There's still Bentham scholars still working on them. And he writes stuff in a very unsystematic fashion. They have a full fleet of secretaries to transcribe them. Remember, there were no copiers then. And to transcribe them and edit them a little bit to legible English. And Mill was his top secretary for a number of years. And the interesting thing is what they thought about each other. Each write to each of their friends. Mill writes to one of his friends and says, Bentham's a pain in the neck. I didn't not know words, but pain in the neck. He's so unsystematic. He just writes on one thing one day, another thing another day. I'm trying to channel him, organize him. He's resisting it. In the meantime, Bentham's writing to his buddy. He says, this guy Mill's a young whippersnapper. He's always trying to run my life. So he's still in all. So there's obvious personality clash, to say the least. They continue on, and he's obviously a very efficient secretary and organizer. So, but the interesting thing about Bentham, he claims he's only a Benthamite, but he has, I'll point out in a minute why, he has a commitment to democracy very early, universal suffrage, which is quite unusual. And he's trying to convert Bentham to democracy. Bentham was originally not a Democrat at all, he was a Tory. He believed in strict suffrage and landlord rule and all the rest of it. And Mill works on Bentham, I'm convinced he works on it in the following way. Bentham is the goal of Bentham's life. And this, by the way, has been carefully overlooked by Bentham admirers of the Legion philosophy movement. The whole goal of Bentham's life was a panopticon. Some wonderful stuff on this, like Gertrude Himmelfarb and Douglas Long, Bentham and Liberty. Bentham and Liberty, if you want to get the full picture. Himmelfarb was very acidulous, properly, I think, discussion of the haunted house of Jeremy Bentham. At any rate, that was his great project. He visited Russia as his brother was an engineer, and he thinks and he works on some of his brother's sketches. And he sees this wonderful idea of the whole world basically as under surveillance. The whole world is a group of forced laborers living in a cell, surveyed and run by a warden with a one-way window to every person. They didn't have the current TV stuff, but one-way mirrors. So they could be seen any time by the warden, and they couldn't see whether the warden was looking at them or not. He wanted the whole world to be in a situation where everybody felt he was under surveillance at all times. That's my ideal. Based on his pleasure-paying calculus. And he worked out many editions of how the panopticon would be run, and she forced the guy to work 12 and a half hours a day, because 12 hours a day is too little. Only a half hour for lunch, and sleep on a hard pallet and on a mattress. The idea is to lower the cost as much as possible and increase the production. As the Benthamite apologists say, it only applies to prisons, humane prison reform. This is baloney. It applies to everything. To workshops, workers, schools, everything is almost. Estimates vary about how much of the English population he wanted to put in panopticons. They vary somewhere between 2/5 and 1/3 or a half. Right? And be run with the perfect Benthamite efficiency. We're calculating all the costs, lowering it as much as possible, keeping guys in this kind of slave labor system. But the real hitch here, the punchline is that who would be the owner of the panopticon? Bentham. The whole point was that Bentham would be the owner. Okay? Everybody has to be conscripted into his panopticon factories. So he kept urging, trying to get the Tory government to pass the bill to launch the panopticon, and they wouldn't do it. They were very bitter about this. At the end of his life, he wrote a vicious attack on King George III. Everybody, they would have passed it, but King George III stopped it because he hated Bentham personally, or something like that. Anyway, Mill comes to him and says, look, obviously the Tory government won't pass the panopticon, but if you have democracy, maybe there's a good chance. That's what people will vote for. I'm sure that's on that basis Bentham becomes a Democrat. And Mill was a Democrat on other grounds, and Mill's triad of principles of democracy, laissez-faire, utilitarianism, with democracy being and utilitarianism being the top rank. Okay, why? This is the point of why he was a Democrat, and here we have the basis of this. It's very interesting. It's fascinating. He was one of the what I call libertarian class conflict analysts, very much like Dunoyer and Comte in France. I'm not sure whether he arrived at it independently or whether he read Dunoyer and Comte. Probably read. I know he read French. Probably read them, and he had a sort of a typically simplistic, non-historical version of it, going to the heart of it, but leaving out all the historical analysis that comes with Dunoyer did. And basically, it was as follows: that every country is run by a ruling class. Ruling class of a few people, and he says. There are two classes of society, said Mill, excuse me. The first class, those who plunder, are the small number. They are the ruling few, capital F. The second class, those who are plundered, are the great number. They are the subject many, capital M. Hamburger summed up Mill's position. Politics is a struggle between two classes, the avaricious rulers and their intended victims. Well, I kind of sympathize with that analysis. Okay, so at any rate, that was his position. And then he said, well, since this is true in all societies, in all countries, particularly in Britain, he wasn't really interested in history. This is Britain of his day. It's certainly true in Britain. You have 100 families, whatever they were running the country. And the great conundrum of government, the political science, is how do you get rid of this? How do you eliminate the ruling class system? And he said that, to take away the power, quote, by which the class of plunderers succeed in carrying on their vocation has ever been the great problem of government. He called the subject many the people. He's probably the first, I don't know if he was the first, one of the first analysts to talk about the people rule, people whatever. It wasn't Marx who ruled, it was James Mill. And so you have the people who are the ruled, and the ruling class he called the special interest, or the sinister interest, another great term of Mill. Sinister special interest versus the ruled subjects. So how do you curb them? And his answer was this. We thought he saw the answer. Quote, the people must appoint watchmen. Who are to watch the watchmen, of course? The great classic question of political philosophy. Who will guard the guardian? The people themselves. There is no other resource, and without this ultimate safeguard, the ruling few will be forever the scourge and oppression of the subject many. Well, how do the people themselves be the watchmen? So then he says, the answer is universal suffrage with all the people electing representatives in Parliament or whatever who do the watching. That was his solution. I don't think it was a very good solution, but that was his solution to the problem. And he said the government of England in his day was, quote, an aristocratical engine wielded by the aristocracy for their own benefit. And by the way, the reason, and I bring in John Stuart again, the reason why he educated his kid in this rather rigorous manner, I should say, and where you stand on this depends on your view of education. I don't really have a theory of education, so but it's kind of interesting because I think most historians think he did it because he had a theory of education and he used his kid as a laboratory experiment. John Stuart, teaching him Greek by the age of 18 months or whatever it was. But that's not really it. The reason he did this is because James Mill, was a cadre leader. He was a leader, intellectual and political leader of the philosophic radicals, and considered the hope of England, at least, or Britain, and not the world. And his kid was going to be his heir, an intellectual and political heir. That was the point. John Stuart was going to be his youth leader, his youth cadre leader, eventually succeeding him as the leader. And that's why the rigor. Well, either you could say that he brainwashed the kid too much, or else the kid wasn't worthy of this rigorous education, whichever, depending on your stance on education theory. At any rate, the kid, John Stuart, wasn't his youth leader. What he'd do is he'd bring his friends, college chums, to see the old man, James Mill, a old charismatic figure, obviously, and he would convert both John Stuart Mill first, and then James Mill, putting the icing on the cake, would convert them to philosophic radicalism in this position. One later Millian, later reminiscing about this, said, James Mill taught me how to think. He changed my life. This whole sort of conversion experience, things you get nowadays when somebody waves crystals at you. Those days, there's a deep conversion experience that changed his life because James Mill was obviously very bright and has this whole system and he's attracted to it. So now the Mill had what the Marxists would later call a transition demand. He obviously knew he was not going to get universal suffrage immediately. Transition demand was the Reform Bill of 1832. Where he bring in the middle class into the representation. And so Mill, in a brilliant stroke of prestidigitation and political activism, organizes orchestrates the entire agitation for the Reform Bill of 1832. He gets it passed, and it's really brilliant piece of political chicanery they engaged in. What happened was he was the Whig government. He realized the Whig government was sort of slightly sympathetic, but was really against it. But they were the moderates compared to the Tories, who were very much opposed to any extension of suffrage. And he managed to get a whole bunch of newspapers under his control. Writers for newspapers, editors. He had the Examiner, which was a leading weekly owned by a Benthamite radical. The Morning Chronicle was edited by an old friend of his named John Black. Spectator was edited by another Benthamite. The Times at that point, one of the Times was friendly to the radicals at this point. He had some guy in Birmingham, who was the editor of the Birmingham paper. And what he did was he orchestrated the press. He'd get a rally for the Reform Bill of 1832, something like that. He had 100 guys would show up for the rally. And his Mill's agent in Birmingham would report 10,000 people were there clamoring, threatening revolution, and so forth. They don't get the Reform Bill passed. And with this kind of organized mendacity, that the tremendous propaganda campaign, which we now call disinformation, that finally persuaded the Whigs, we're going to have a revolution on our hands if we don't pass it. It was all nonsense. We're going to have any revolution. They were convinced of it because of Mill's temporary control of propaganda, of the press, propaganda organs, and they got the bill passed. And this was leaked by John Roebuck, his assistant, in his memoirs, The History of How the Reform Bill was passed. About 15 years later, he leaked this. He said people didn't realize that all these alleged leaders were really controlled by a couple of shadowy people who were pulling the strings behind the scenes, namely, of course, James Mill. And the interesting thing, in order to pave the way for this is typical of Mill, by the way. He wanted to do what the Marxists would call unified theory and praxis. He's got to engage in a mass campaign of lying for the good, in other words, to expand democracy. He's got to justify it philosophically. He writes an article, it's okay to lie for a worthy end. And he says, kind of cute. He says, while truth is important, he conceded, there are special circumstances, quote, in which another man is not entitled to the truth, unquote. Men, he wrote, should not be told the truth when they make bad use of it, unquote. It's an interesting thing. Of course, typical utilitarian argument, right? The guy is entitled to the truth only if he's going to make good use of it. Of course, it's up to the guy to decide on it, whether or not it's going to be good or not. It's up to the utilitarian person who's doing the truth telling, all the lying, to figure out whether the guy's going to make good use of it or not. And then he says, in politics, it's even more so. He says, in politics, disseminating what he called wrong information, very close to this concept of disinformation, which should be the language of the CIA. Disseminating wrong information, quote, is not a breach of morality, but on the contrary, a meritorious act when it is conducive to the prevention of misrule. In no instance is any man less entitled to right information than when he would employ it for the perpetuation of misrule. Okay, so he gets the Reform Bill passed, and he gets this group of about 10 to 20 people in Parliament. He has a tool. He couldn't go to run for Parliament himself. He didn't have the money. He had to work for the full-time East India Company. So he had these guys who were wealthier do it, and he had the head of the radicals was George Gross. Later became a banker, later became a distinguished classical historian. And Gross was sort of his abject tool. It's very interesting how this works. They obviously know a tremendous charismatic force, James Mill. And Gross, according to Hamburger, Gross was so inoculated, as it were, that for him all of Mill's dicta, quote, assume the force and sanction of duties, unquote. Great to be in that position. I need to say something so somebody takes it as a moral duty to carry it out. Interesting. By the way, as a little sort of feminist note here, The leader of the Millian Circle was Solomon Mrs. Grote, Harriet Lewin Grote, imperious and assertive militant, who was widely known as the Queen of the Radicals. And Cobden wrote, had she been a man, she would have been the leader of a party. Okay, so this is Mill as a political activist, and Mill as a political theorist, and it all fits in. It's all harmonious structure. To get more to this strict economic stuff, what was Mill's relationship to Ricardo? Of course, I'm beginning to run out of time here, but Ricardo, first of all, I think we have to realize Ricardo didn't know. He read Adam Smith in a seaside resort. Improbable. It's interesting. Go to a seaside resort, vacation resort. You pick up his book. I mean, nowadays you pick up a Gothic romance or a spy novel. He picked up Smith's Wealth of Nations and loved it. So it was conversion. But basically, he didn't really know anything about economics except money and banking. He knew a lot about that. He was a bond dealer. He intervened in the famous Bunyan dispute. But the rest of he didn't know much about anything else. And he wanted to retire. His object, he was very wealthy. He was a millionaire at the age of 40 or so. He wanted to retire, become a country squire. He wanted to live a quiet life. But Mill gets a hold of him. Mill takes hold of him. And Mill, quote, forces him, unquote, to be the great economist. You're going to be the great economist, David. And Mill's relationship to Ricardo was out of a sort of a very nagging and forceful PhD mentor. You got to write this. You got to write this book. You got to change this chapter. Put that in. They have long walks together, writing. Mill keeps correcting Ricardo's stuff and adding stuff and taking stuff out. And finally, the book is finally finished. Principles of Great Economy. And Ricardo wants to retire again. Mill says, no, now you got to go enter Parliament. You got to be our leader in Parliament. He becomes a leader in Parliament. He does anything Mill tells him to do, Ricardo did. So, and we put that in the context, putting those general personality as relationship to Ricardo, that was a dominant force, except on money and banking. I think we had to qualify that. And then we find out with Sweat and Sweet and Hutchins and so forth, we find out several interesting things. We find out, for example, that Mill, the first guy, discovers Say's law, brings it into English economics, tells it to Ricardo, convinces Ricardo of it. So Say's law, a very important part of the system, transmitted from Mill to Ricardo, and I think it was 1808. And in his book in 1804, it turns out, which he wrote before he met Ricardo, Mill develops the basic outlines of the Ricardian system, the economic system. Not as far as I know the rent theory, but virtually all the rest of it. The Corn model, for example. Quickly on that. In his work in 1804, he typically, of course, Mill is he oversimplifies it and cuts off the heart of it, but also makes it very extreme, like taking chunks of aggregates and assuming it's real and all that. He's the one who stresses long-run equilibrium for the health. For example, he's an extreme Malthusian in this book. In other words, no longer is it a long-run tendency or a short-run tendency even for population to press on the food supply. Population always does. The wage rate is always at the subsistence level, period. Okay? Because you're always in long-run equilibrium, that's miserable, of course. The wage rates are always inevitably doomed. I think he even says that he says, for example, a statement by Mill here, no one will hesitate to allow that the tendency of the species to multiply is much greater than the rapidity with which there's any chance that the fruits of the earth will be multiplied. And he says, raise corn as fast as you please. Mouths are producing so fast that they eat it. So you no way to get out of this. No way. Population, he adds, is invariably pressing close upon the heels of subsistence. And whatever quantity food be produced, the demand will always be produced greater than the supply. You're always in deep doo-doo, the beloved president would say. The wage rate is at subsistence level going down below it. And corn is assumed to be the surrogate for all food. And therefore, the price, and I guess it has in a sense of the rent model, because since the price of corn is always going up because the rent of the land is getting poorer and poorer, the wage rate has to go up because otherwise you're going below subsistence level, and therefore price for profit is always falling. You've got the outlines of the whole business. As early as 1804, and he concludes there, he concludes that the wage rate is highly regulated by the money price of corn. That's by the way, wheat for those of English. The English have a peculiar linguistic thing they call wheat corn. Okay, so the profits must always be falling. And it really has the whole bit. Rents are going up inexorably, profits are always falling, etc., etc. By the way, in addition to that, he's the first Henry Georges. He's the first guy who sees the logic of Ricardo. That landlords are always, first of all, landlords are not productive. They capture the inherited powers of the soil. Things got the other word in the phrase. And the landlords are eating up more and more percentage of the product. Because rents are eating up more and more as profits fall and wage rates are at a consistent level. Rents are always increasing. So Ricardo doesn't carry to the logical political conclusion, but Mill does. He's in favor of a tax on land values. But he doesn't. He knows he can't introduce it in England. It's ridiculous, not political. So he tries to introduce it in India, which he have not political. So he tries to introduce it in India, which he's helping to run. The land value tax in India. He doesn't have the moral argument Henry George has, of course, but he has the economic utilitarian version of it. Then we have what Sweet has done. I think some great research here. Is he's shown that if you're left with the Ricardian system as being a product of Mill and not Ricardo, it seems that the only thing Ricardo's got aside from money and banking is the law of comparative advantage. Trade takes place and exchange takes place, but the people who are most best at something or least worse at something, not just an absolute advantage. A great argument for free trade. And Sweet has shown that Ricardo was not interested in this, he didn't care about it, he never used it. Comparative advantage. And Mill, on the other hand, originated it in 1807, I think it was, 1808. I think in a book review of 1807, William Spencer was a young English physiocrat, therefore believed that only agriculture is important, who cares about anything else? Consumptionist, as the physiocrats were too. In 1807, he published a book called Britain Independent of Commerce, which he says everybody's worrying about Napoleon's embargo. What's the matter with the embargo? It's great, who cares? Only agriculture is important, let's consume the stuff at home. And so in defense of international trade, Mill writes his book review in the Eclectic Review and expands it into his Commerce Defense in 1808. And brings forth the law of comparative advantage. Well, the interesting thing is, apparently Ricardo didn't care about it. Well, Ricardo was not in favor of free trade, period. He was only in favor of free trade and importation of corn. You want to get the landlords off our backs, and their backs for at least 20 years. In other words, you do that, to lower the price of corn imports, it means the wage rates can go down, and profits will increase for a while. So and capital will then expand. That's why Ricardo was in favor. He wasn't in favor of free trade in general. Didn't care about it. Mill did care about it. So Mill gets Ricardo to include the law of comparative advantage in a couple of paragraphs in his book, and that's it. And Ricardo never refers to it again. Mill refers to it all the time. So it turns out that Mill was a free trader. Mill was a law of comparative advantage person. Ricardo simply is totally obsessed with the little model, the corn model, and the land rent model. And that's all he cared about. So again, we have a Millian law of comparative advantage instead of Ricardian. The final note on this thing is the thing that has puzzled me for a while. Namely, why is it? Maybe when John Stuart Mill, get back last to John Stuart, engages in his, first of all, his relationship to his father was extremely peculiar. I think I'm opposed to psycho-history and psychobabble history. But in the case of John Stuart Mill, you can almost justify psychobabble. John Stuart Mill, while his father's alive, pretends to be a hardcore Millian. He's writing, for example, he writes an article praising Bentham, signing his own name on it, under it. At the same time, he writes an article under a pseudonym attacking Bentham. This is sick. It's some inner duplicity at work. Anyway, after his father died, and he sort of falls away from the cause and everything, but in 1848 he wants to reestablish Millian doctrine, his father's doctrine. most people say he wants to reestablish Ricardian doctrine. It's really Millian doctrine. I think coming more and more to the conclusion. It's filial pietism at work. He's paying his final respect to his old man when he was betrayed in his youth and all that sort of stuff. So, and he reestablished the labor theory of value, which, by the way, I didn't have a chance to go into this. Labor theory of value, in my view, is Calvinist. The reason why Smith adopts it, pushes, and the reason why Mill adopts it, pushes is Calvinist heritage. Ricardo, of course, is not a Calvinist. So if you see the Mill is the real author of it, it becomes clearer. Reestablished the labor theory of value with qualifications, but it's still there. The whole system of the old man is back, except one thing: the monetary stuff. The place, I think Ricardo's really best contribution is monetary business cycle analysis, monetary theory of business cycles. Mill doesn't have that. Mill adopts the banking school version, and in the mid-1840s, he takes the view, and you think with his heritage, he'd be a currency school person, because of bank credit expansion and of course the business cycle with inflation is the bank credit expansion, money supply. Instead of that, he takes the banking school view. No, money supply is passive. The banks are simply recipients of. It's really the cause of the business cycle is really deep in trade. Something about trade and industry which causes increased demand for money. Banks are simply passive recipients of this. Well, it turns out, so it looks like an anomaly. Why is Mill taking his position? He's trying to restore his father's doctrine. Morris Perlman, in a recent article in Hope, talking about Adam Smith, which Mill is sort of James Mill is sort of an appendage to, only 2 pages, points out that Mill was an early extreme version of a banking school person. And this is very interesting. This fits in with my general view here. Perlman calls the real Bill's doctrine simply it's really a banking school doctrine, a wild version of it, namely that bank money is always voluntary, it's received voluntarily. Any excess of bank money over absolute minimum will be immediately returned to the banks. There's no problem, no such thing as increase. Don't worry about increasing money supply or overuse increasing money supply or anything of that sort. There's none of Adam Smith's qualifications about self-liquidating short-term credit or that sort of thing. It's all starkly banking school doctrine. Published in 1808 in a review of a book by Thomas Smith, an Edinburgh Review by James Mill. So now we've found that this sort of completes the picture, I think, of John Stewart. He's restoring his filial pietism, restoring James Mill, including the banking school doctrine, which has not been known until now that James Mill was a partisan of that. He didn't write that much on banking. So, I think to conclude about James Mill, I think a fascinating character, tough, fascinating, hardcore type. Why did he underplay his achievements? And why? I mean, Adam Smith, for example, thought he invented everything. He invented liberty, he invented free market, he invented natural law, whatever. He's constantly attacking people for being plagiarists. And this is more usual, I think, in history of thought. Somebody keeps saying, no, I'm simply humble, whatever. Especially a person who obviously was not humble. Well, a friend of mine said, I was talking to a friend of mine, a historian, about this. He said, look, why don't you look at the economic aspect of this? Right? Namely, Mill was an impoverished freelance writer, Bentham was extremely wealthy, and Ricardo was extremely wealthy. And you're telling your wealthy buddies or patrons or whatever, hey, you're the real master, you're the inventor, whereas I'm just your humble servant. And that might be a cynical approach, but I think it's realistic. Knowing also that Mill is a sort of deceptive type anyway. Deception is good if it promotes good ends. So I think that's solved the historical puzzle about Mill. And I think, as I say, he's a fascinating character. I think more interesting really than John Stewart, to get right down to it. So that's my personal bias. Thank you.